Good evening, everyone. I appreciate we've got attendees drawn far and wide this evening. So welcome. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first lecture in the Aston Talks series. At Aston, we have a tradition of celebrating with our outstanding academics who are promoted or appointed to the role of professor by holding an inaugural lecture and giving our new professor the opportunity to share a glimpse of their academic passions and areas of expertise. The current pandemic means that we're unable to do these in person at this time, but having successfully transferred our coursework lectures online, we decided to follow suit with our inaugural lectures and therefore enable this popular series to continue. This evening's speaker is Professor Ed Sweeney, Professor of Logistics and Systems and Head of the Department of Engineering Systems and Supply Chain Management here at Aston. Ed's early career commenced in his home country of Ireland, where he graduated in 1986 from Trinity College Dublin with a first-class honours degree in mechanical and manufacturing engineering. He went on to study for an MPhil from the University of Warwick and completed a postgraduate certificate while undertaking his doctoral studies at the University of Hull Logistics Institute. Since then, Ed has held full-time academic posts at the University of Warwick and the University of Technology Malaysia, as well as visiting positions in several universities and institutes. He has worked and lectured in over 70 countries in Europe, North America, Asia and Africa. He is an experienced researcher with over 200 publications, including books and papers in international peer-reviewed academic journals. Ed also worked with many of the world's leading companies in his role as an educator and facilitator. Before he came to Aston, Ed was director at the National Institute for Transport and Logistics, based at Technological University Dublin, where he was responsible for the award-winning supply chain management development programs. In his spare time, Ed regularly attends a variety of sporting and cultural events, and I believe he will be drawing on some of these experiences in his talk tonight. He maintains close links with his hometown of Wexford, where he is a friend of Wexford Festival Opera and a member of the Wexford Historical Society. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce and a member of the Delius Society. He engages actively in the scientific and cultural life of Birmingham, including through his involvement with the Lunar Society and the Birmingham and Midland Institute, and as a patron of the Sutton Coldfield Choral Society. This evening, Ed will be introducing the fascinating but often invisible world of logistics. Products and services reach the final user through complex global networks of companies and processes. Economic and societal well-being in the 21st century is critically dependent on the logistics systems that underpin these supply chains. In his talk, Ed will explore how the effective application of engineering principles and concepts, particularly design and systems thinking, can help to address some of the mega challenges facing logisticians and other supply chain professionals. I'm therefore delighted to welcome Professor Ed Sweeney to explain Engineering 21st Century Logistics Systems, a Cultural Perspective. Ed.
Thank you very much for your generous introduction, Alec. I hope everyone can hear me. I also hope that you can hear some music behind me. If you can, the music that you're listening to is the opening part of the Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, composed by Benjamin Britten, and this particular version is from a 1995 recording by the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Sir Simon Rattle. As Alec alluded to, the aim of this presentation is to explore logistics and supply chain management, and what I intend to do is to use a variety of cultural references to illustrate some of the key points. More specifically, my focus will be on designing and reconfiguring supply chain and logistics systems in an effort to make them fit for purpose in the face of the myriad challenges that we're facing in the 20th century. So my agenda for this evening's talk comprises 5 elements. So firstly, I will try to answer 3 questions. Firstly, what is a supply chain? What is supply chain management, and what is logistics? Then we'll move on to talk about some of the mega challenges facing supply chains and supply chain professionals in the 21st century. I think it's important to always look back at what we've done in the past and to learn what we can from our past experiences. So I will say something about the suboptimal approaches that we've occasionally used in the past in a supply chain context. But we ought to also, of course, look towards the future, and the core of my presentation will focus, as Alex said in his introduction, on contemporary logistics systems and on looking at the whole issue of how we design and how we re-engineer these logistics systems in the face of some of the challenges that we face. And what I will do is, in about 40 minutes time, I will leave you with some concluding comments. So part 1 of the agenda, what is a supply chain? Many different definitions of what a supply chain is, but let's think about a product reaching the final consumer on the right hand side of this graphic, and a product reaches the final consumer through a chain of companies, and that chain of companies typically includes suppliers, processors, distributors, and retailers. So the short answer to the question, what is a supply chain, is it's a chain of companies. If we think about an industry, a sector like the food sector, for example, we often talk about the supply chain going from the farm to the fork, the farm as the source of the product right through to the consumer consuming the food using a fork. Now, the interesting thing about this graphic is that when we think about a chain of companies as a supply chain, the idea of the weakest link is a very important one. So really what this is about recognizing is that without the right companies across the supply chain to work with, and indeed without the right kinds of relationships, one individual organization will never be able to achieve its true competitive potential. In other words, the supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Sometimes we make the statement too that, for example, a supply chain is only as fast as its slowest link. So a supply chain we can think of as a chain of companies. There is a second, at least a second way in which we can think about a supply chain. If we think about a product supply chain, a manufacturing focused supply chain, we can think about these 5 sort of key functions or key processes. Supply chains involve buying stuff, making stuff through manufacturing processes, storing stuff at various points in the supply chain, and eventually moving stuff, transporting product to the final customer so we can sell the product. Now, what's interesting is, if we look at lots of traditionally managed organizations, these functions were often measured very much in isolation from each other. And because we measured them very much in isolation from each other, they often ended up being managed in isolation and often operating at cross purposes. So something which was a characteristic of many traditionally managed supply chains was fragmentation. And really what 21st century supply chain management is about is it's about trying to replace that fragmentation with an approach which is characterized by integration. So supply chain management, in essence, is about integrating these processes, and it does that by trying to manage the various flow systems in the supply chain in as holistic a fashion as possible. I can't, and this comes with due apologies to my current and former students. I have developed my own sort of definition of supply chain management. It's really a definitional construct which attempts to define supply chain management concisely, but yet comprehensively. And this is something I refer to as the 4 fundamentals of supply chain management. Just very briefly, the first fundamental is about ensuring that we have clarity in relation to our objectives. And traditionally, the objectives were around the optimization of total supply chain cost and investment, the enhancement of customer satisfaction, but increasingly an objective around environmental sustainability, and the need to do things in a greener way is being incorporated into that mix. Second, the second key element of this goes back to the concept of integration. In many ways, if you like, the philosophy of contemporary supply chain management can be captured in that one single word. So supply chain philosophy really says, let's do what we can to achieve higher levels of integration across processes, higher levels of data integration, and so on. The real question then becomes, what do we need to do to achieve our objectives as articulated in fundamental number 1? What do we then need to do from a practical point of view to operationalize this supply chain philosophy? And the answer really becomes managing the key supply chain flow systems. And as you may have noticed on some of the previous graphics, the sort of key flows that we think about in a typical supply chain are the flow of materials, the flow of product from one side to the other, the flow of money from customers back down the supply chain, and most importantly, perhaps, we've got the flow of information in both directions. And I've always contended that it's the efficient and effective management of these information flows that provides the real critical success factor in this context. And recent developments that we've seen in terms of information and communication technology represent a key enabler in this process. And finally, if supply chain integration is fundamentally what we're trying to achieve, for many organizations, that requires a reappraisal, a reassessment, sometimes quite a radical reappraisal and reassessment of the way in which internal and external relationships work. So that's relationships between teams within the same organization, and of course it's about relationships between the different companies that comprise the overall supply chain. So that really is my definition of what supply chain management is all about, but the key element of this really is the second element, which focuses on the idea of integration. So in many ways, the big idea or the central tenet of contemporary supply chain management thinking lies in the whole concept of integration. And I think that can be well illustrated in a number of ways, but the orchestral analogy, I think, is a useful one in this context. Earlier you heard, I hope you heard, a short piece from the Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. This is a piece of music that was composed by Benjamin Britten in 1946 with a subtitle, Variations and Fugue, on a theme of Purcell. The original was written by Henry Purcell in the late 17th century. The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra is one of Benjamin Britten's best known pieces and is widely used and has been widely used for several decades by music educators. So the short piece of music we heard earlier was the introduction, where the theme is initially played by the entire orchestra. But what happens then is, following the introduction, the theme is played subsequently by each major family of instruments of the orchestra. So as we can see on the slide, that's the woodwind, the strings, the brass, and the percussion. So each variation then features a particular instrument from the various families, and in general the piece moves within each family from high to low. So for example, in the strings section, the variation begins with violins, it then moves through the violas and cellos into the double basses. So really what happens in this piece of music is the complete orchestra is effectively dismantled into its constituent sections and individual players. And I think the core supply chain management concept of integration can be seen clearly with reference really to any pursuit that requires groups of individuals to work together. If we take the orchestra as a case in point, can you imagine if the various sections of a symphony orchestra were to play in isolation from each other, irrespective of the virtuosity of individual players and section leaders? The result would likely be noise to most ears. Although I have heard some people argue that the result might be some form of modern jazz, but that's probably a little bit cruel to modern jazz musicians. However, with the aid of sheet music and with the aid of a conductor, harmony can be added, resulting in music to our ears. And it's interesting because in that context, the sheet music becomes analogous to our overall supply chain plan, and the conductor becomes analogous to the supply chain director or the supply chain manager. So they assume that they ensure that the plan and the conductor help to ensure that the players operate as a team and perform in an integrated fashion. Now look, like any analogy, this one will collapse if we try to extend it too far, but I think the Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra provides us with an interesting and hopefully insightful way of illustrating the centrality of teams and teamwork and integration in the context of the overall supply chain management concept. In other words, it's hopefully an insightful way of illustrating supply chain management's big idea or central tenet of integration. Now, the other word which is important in this context is the word logistics. We have many different definitions of this word. One of the most widely cited definitions comes from the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, or CSCMP. This is the main professional body for logisticians in North America. I won't go through the whole of this definition, it's a bit of a mouthful, but the key thing to notice here is that logistics is part of supply chain management, and it's that part which focuses on the two key words which I've highlighted here. So it focuses on the flow and storage of stuff. So really what logistics is about is the physical movement of stuff and the physical storage of stuff. So if we go back to the buy, make, store, move, sell model, which I put up earlier, logistics is really that part of supply chain management that focuses on the move and store links in that chain. Now, why is this important? It's important for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, if we think about logistics and transport as a sector, even narrowly defined, in a UK context, and we have similar numbers in other countries, this sector accounts for at least 1 in 12 jobs in the economy. And if we look at projections of employment growth in the logistics sector, the growth forecasts are running at about 30%. So between now and 2035, we expect employment to grow by about 30%. So that's a much bigger increase than we see in other sectors of the economy. In purely financial terms, the transport and logistics sector contributes in excess of 100 billion GVA in the UK per annum, with a very significant proportion of that generated here in the Midlands. But logistics and transport are much more important than the logistics and transport sector, because companies across all sectors in manufacturing and retail and so on, and companies of all sizes depend for their well-being on an efficient and effective logistics network. So in that sense, logistics and associated supply chain activities are crucial to economic well-being, but indeed they're also crucial to wider societal well-being, and that's something which I think became very evident to us all over the course of the last 7 or 8 months. Here in the Midlands, given that we are a natural geographical hub for logistics and related activities, logistics is of particular significance in the local economy. For example, the English Midlands is home to what we in logistics refer to as the Golden Triangle, and this is a very heavy concentration of logistics and distribution businesses, and that area of the Golden Triangle is within 4 hours drive of 95% at least of the population of the UK. So the Midlands location, natural geographical hub, making this a hugely important activity in our region in particular. So I hope the fact that logistics is of vital strategic importance is evident. But despite its importance, the logistics sector often remains relatively invisible to us. And often the only time it becomes visible, unfortunately, is when something goes wrong. And we had two very good examples of things going wrong back in the summer of 2018. The first very high profile one related to Colonel Saunders and his chicken. And they posted lots of messages around the place apologizing to customers for a serious breakdown in their supply chain. As you can see from this one, it says, "A chicken restaurant without any chicken. It's not ideal. Huge apologies to our customers, especially those who've traveled to find our product." They turned their messaging into something actually quite humorous. So they began to talk about chickens crossing roads and other chickens waiting at pelican crossings. But behind this humor, we had a serious supply chain failure. And this note that was posted on the door of a closed KFC outlet is apologizing for being closed, and it's explaining, if you can read that, that we've brought a new delivery partner on board, but they've had a couple of teething problems. And they go on to say that getting fresh chicken out to 900 restaurants is a complex task. So that was one example of a supply chain that failed to work, that stopped working well, suddenly became visible to us. Another example from the summer of 2018 was when we had a major failure in the CO2 supply chain. There's a typical headline we saw from the media at the time: CO2 shortage causes a supply chain meltdown. This was particularly noticeable in the food industry. CO2 is used in the food industry in a variety of different ways. In farming, to stun animals before slaughter, to extend the product shelf life of vegetables, meat, poultry, for example, and also to add fizz to beer and fizzy drinks. Now, if you think back to the summer of 2018, I can remember two things. One was it was a particularly warm summer. It was one of the warmest summers on record, I think, and it was also the summer of a football World Cup, and a World Cup in which England did pretty well. But we ended up in a situation where people were going to pubs and such to watch football, but we were running out of fizz. And this was a serious problem. So going to a pub and finding it difficult to buy beer or to buy fizzy drinks was a bit of a problem. So the point here, the serious point, is that supply chains are often invisible to us when working well, and the net result of that is that logistics is often referred to as the invisible profession, despite the fact that it's critically of massive importance. So critically important, but often invisible. Let me move into the next piece in my presentation, and it's about trying to identify what the sort of mega challenges are that we're facing in supply chains, and the mega challenges that supply chain managers, supply chain professionals are facing. It's probably an impossible task. It's certainly an invidious task to try to develop an exhaustive list of these challenges. So what I've tried to do here is I've tried to list some of the things which I believe to be key challenges and issues across companies in a wide range of different sectors. I mean, the first big supply chain challenge, the first key big business challenge in all sectors is about competition. Intense competition, often characterized as hyper competition, and markets which have become much more sophisticated, and customers which have become much more discerning. Customers looking for more and more in terms of value, more and more in terms of quality and service, and the competition is pushing prices down. So we live in intensely competitive business environments. Secondly, we've seen a massive rate of growth in terms of the technologies that can support supply chains, and particularly the technologies that can support supply chain integration. This is a massive opportunity, but it's also a massive threat. We have to remember in this context that the vast majority of companies in the UK and elsewhere, and the vast majority of companies in most supply chains, are the SMEs and the small companies. In the logistics sector, for example, we have a highly fragmented industry in that we have quite a small number of very large players, but the vast majority of companies are small organizations, sometimes micro businesses, companies, often family-run businesses with 1 or 2 vehicles. And simply keeping abreast of rapid developments in technology becomes a massive challenge for these organizations. And we do have significant evidence of what we refer to as a digital divide between the large players, the small number of large players, and the very large number of SMEs. Now, one of the upshots of rapidly developing technology is that we now have the capability to collect data at all points in the supply chain, from the farm to the fork, if you will. So what we're doing is we're increasingly collecting large volumes of data about a wide variety of variables right across the supply chain. Now, that data on its own is of very little value to us. So one of the big challenges been faced by supply chain professionals is around what is sometimes referred to as the big data conundrum. So how can we take that data, that voluminous data, and transform it into something which is useful and usable. And really it's about transforming data into useful information, useful from a decision-making point of view. In some parts of the supply chain, and particularly in logistics, we have a well-documented shortage of talent. And one of the things we at the university are working very hard to do in partnership with professional bodies and companies is to squarely address this talent challenge. And that's about attracting new people into the supply chain profession and educating new people for the profession. But it's also about re-educating and upskilling existing talent within the profession. So talent management is a massive challenge. If the COVID-19 pandemic over recent months has taught us one thing in a supply chain context, it is about the importance of resilience. If we cast our minds back to somewhere around the early to middle part of March, when the lockdown was imminent, one of the things we saw was a lot of panic buying by people. We saw lots of stockpiling of products in people's homes. We saw empty shelves in many cases. And of course, the ubiquitous toilet roll became emblematic of that whole period. But one of the things that was fascinating back then was the biggest single storage location, the biggest single warehouse in the UK wasn't one of the big sheds that we see in the Golden Triangle, but it was people's cupboards and fridges. And we reckon at one point that we had about £1 billion worth of stuff sitting in people's fridges and in people's cupboards. But the interesting thing was supply chains bounced back pretty quickly from that. So no supply chain is designed to cope with a spike in demand of that kind. But despite this massive spike in demand, the supply chains did bounce back pretty quickly. The other thing that's interesting is probably in my career, the biggest single change we've seen in supply chains is they've shifted from being largely local or regional in focus to being much more international and in some cases genuinely global in complexion. And this hasn't happened by accident. This has happened as a direct result of significant structural change that we've seen in the international economic and business environment. And in particular, what we've seen is a reduction over a period of time in the barriers that traditionally existed to the movement of product across international borders, but also to the movement of people, the movement of knowledge, the movement of money, the movement of information, and so on. So what this means is that we have supply chains which are increasingly international, and that means that they are subject to the volatility which is a feature of the international economic and political landscape. And hashtag Brexit reality is just one example of this. We're sitting here in late October. We are 65 days away from the end of the Brexit transition period. And really, it's been the logistics profession, which in many ways has been at the vanguard of trying to deal with this sort of new normal. And we still have quite a lot of uncertainty about how that is likely to pan out over the next couple of months. And finally, the biggest single challenge probably of all of these is around environmental degradation. We know that supply chain activities negatively impact the natural environment, particularly transportation activities. If we think about freight transportation, it continues to be heavily reliant on road transport, particularly here in the UK, and road transportation continues to have a stubborn dependence on fossil fuels. So a huge issue for supply chain professionals in the 21st century is really around how can we do things in a more environmentally sustainable way in the context of the climate emergency. Now, the last three items on my list here, I think are captured quite well in this graphic. So we have COVID-19. The graphic says, be sure to wash your hands and all will be well. And coming up behind that, we have Brexit and the uncertainty associated with that. And the biggest single threat really is around climate change. If we stand back from all of this, I think we sometimes talk about the environment for supply chains being characterized by this idea of VUCA. So we see lots of volatility, we see lots of uncertainty, we see lots of complexity, and we see lots of ambiguity. And in some ways, that's become the new normal. And the new normal, of course, is a phrase which has become very popular during these challenging times. But in a supply chain context, I think it's that VUCA idea which captures that very, very well. Now, I would contend that in addressing these challenges, the effective implementation of supply chain management, of contemporary supply chain management, as articulated, for example, in the four fundamentals construct, offers a huge amount of potential. And we have lots of empirical evidence from academic studies to back up that contention. So significant evidence that the effective implementation of contemporary supply chain management can result in significant improvements and squarely address many of the challenges to which my previous slide referred. And I've just given a few examples of academic research from a variety of different geographical and sectoral contexts which illustrate that precise point. There is a however coming, and the however is that putting this relatively compelling supply chain management narrative, putting that theory into practice is not an easy thing to do. And as far back as 2002, a widely cited study by a group of researchers led by Leenders said, and I quote, SCM is a sound concept, but turning the idea into practice is not easy. And so far, so this is almost 20 years ago, it's received more lip service than actual accomplishment, except perhaps in a few leading edge companies. And the lip service idea is interesting because we have a lot of evidence that a number of organizations fell into what we might refer to as the lip service trap. And what I mean by the lip service trap is that if we talk about something for long enough, we begin to believe that we're actually doing it. A study from 5 years after that, undertaken by my sometime collaborator, Natalie Fab-Cost, and her colleagues, stated that we can confirm that integration is more rhetoric than reality, and that it might be more difficult in practice than in theory. And Natalie and her colleagues used their own cultural reference in their paper on this subject, where they talked about, as you can see in the slide, the emperor's new suit or the emperor's new clothes. And bringing the story up to date, some of my own research in recent years suggests that this difficulty of turning supply chain management theory into practice is one which we continue to see, albeit to a lesser extent. So in my work from 2018, I talked about the understanding into action conundrum. This is about saying that many organizations seem to have a very good understanding of what supply chain management means, at least on a conceptual level, but often, and indeed often, have a very good appreciation of its strategic importance, but find it very difficult to put it into practice. So another phrase we coined for that phenomenon is the implementation deficit disorder. And just to illustrate this, When we speak to senior supply chain professionals about the importance of integration, and remember, integration is the big idea, the central tenet of contemporary supply chain management, the vast majority of people agree that it is very, very important. However, when we look at the manner in which integration actually happens, when we look at the extent of integration, for example, with customers, we see a tiny minority of companies that are fully integrated, and less than a third of companies that would even could be classified as being highly integrated. So again, it gives us some insights into the practical difficulties of putting some of these ideas into practice. So why has this happened? I think it's important to look back at this phenomenon and perhaps to identify some of the suboptimal approaches that we've adopted in the past. The first suboptimal approach that's often been adopted is we try to copy inappropriate solutions. So we look at something that's worked really, really well in one sector or in one organization, and we try to copy that. Now, the reality is that every supply chain supplies different products. It's got different processes. Perhaps most importantly, it's got different people and therefore a different culture. So just because something works really well in one context does not necessarily mean it's going to work well elsewhere. Secondly, often as a consequence of poorly designed performance measurement systems, organizations often fail to identify what the real problems are. And allied to that, we have the issue of organizations failing to recognize that many of the problems that they face are very closely interconnected and interrelated. And systems thinking is really about saying, let's begin to focus on the interconnectedness and the interrelationships between these different problems rather than tackling problems in isolation. The other thing we've often done in the past is we focused on planning, we focused on the execution or implementation of those plans. We've become much better at identifying how technology can support this process, but we remain pretty poor in terms of the design of supply chains in the first instance. At a recent event I was at, I heard a very senior industry person refer to many of the supply chains that he had worked in as a series of historical accidents. In other words, entities which had happened and which had evolved over time rather than entities which had been properly designed. And the final thing that we have often seen is a situation where organizations look for magic solutions. And these magic solutions always put me in mind of Douglas Adams, and in particular the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which many of you will be familiar with. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was originally created by Douglas Adams as a radio comedy for BBC4 back in the late 70s. It was later adapted into other formats, including, interestingly, a trilogy of 5 books, a TV series, and a 2005 feature film. And the link on the screen here, which I can't show you, is a short excerpt from that 2005 film version. And what this short excerpt refers to is the answer. The answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the answer is 42. But what's the question? I mean, without formulating the right question, the answer is, of course, meaningless. So in this context, 42 becomes the answer. It becomes the panacea. It becomes the silver bullet. It becomes a magic solution. However, the sort of VUCA, the uncertainty and complexity that we see in the supply chain environment means that, sadly, there isn't any magic solution or panacea. There isn't any 42. And by the way, Douglas Adams had lots of things to say which I think resonate with supply chain professionals. For example, Douglas Adams told us that to give real service, you must add something which cannot be bought or measured with money, and that is sincerity and integrity. As a design engineer by background, I particularly like the second one. A common mistake that people make when trying to design something completely foolproof is to underestimate the ingenuity of complete fools. The next one will resonate with all of us, I think. I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make as they fly past. And finally, and this is a good one for transportation professionals, I seldom end up where I wanted to go, but almost always end up where I need to be. So on a more serious note, and reflecting on the past and learning from the past, yes, but focusing on the future and thinking about how we might redesign our supply chain systems, engineering has an important role to play, and I say this as an engineer myself. So what is engineering? The Royal Academy of Engineering highlight three different things. So firstly, engineers make things, they make things work, and they make things work better. Certainly in the context of logistics and supply chain management, the ideas of making things work and making things work better are absolutely relevant. The second point here is probably the most important one. Engineers use their creativity to design solutions to the world's problems, and on that basis, engineers therefore help to build the future. So to me, what good engineering is it's about the creative application of scientific and technological knowledge to the solution of important global problems. And in this context, I think my world of logistics and supply chain management has a lot to learn from engineering. So when we talk about engineering the way forward, as Alex said in his introduction, I'm a mechanical engineer by background. My first degree comes from the University of Dublin, Trinity College. I don't hold a BEng or a BSc, I hold a peculiarly Dublin qualification, which is a BAI, and that's Latin. It stands for Baccalaureus in Arte Ingeniaria. So it's a Bachelor in the Art of Engineering. So I think there's a recognition in that degree title of the importance of the artistic and creative aspect of engineering. And interestingly, probably the two most famous graduates from the BAI program are the polymath Percy French, who was probably best known as a songwriter. If any of you have been in an Irish pub late at night, you've probably heard his songs being sung. One very famous one is about a West of Ireland railway called Are You Right There, Michael? Are You Right? And probably the second most famous graduate of the engineering program in Trinity in Dublin is Nathaniel Hone the Younger. And this is a photograph I took of one of his paintings during a recent visit to the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin. So it's interesting that graduates from this program, the most famous ones, went on to become well known in the sort of cultural and artistic realm. But turning back, before I finish, to the way forward from a logistics and supply chain perspective, I think the future will depend largely on the effective application of robust engineering design principles, very well established principles. If we think about supply chains, they are complex human, cyber, physical systems, and we need to have a strong focus on their proactive design. And something I noticed when I began to work in the supply chain area was, and particularly as somebody from a design engineering background, was that there was a lack of emphasis on this whole area. And consequently, we ended up seeing a lot of supply chains that were historical accidents. So what we often end up doing in reality in these situations is we end up trying to make the best of a bad lot. We end up trying to make the best of a bad situation. So we end up, as I said before, with this emphasis on planning and implementation and technology, but at the expense of design. So just two examples of how this can work in practice. One is something we refer to the system as the systems approach to supply chain design. It's not an accident that the department which I lead is called Engineering Systems and Supply Chain Management. And something which relates very closely to this and relates back to how I became involved in supply chains is something we refer to as three-dimensional concurrent engineering. And that's about simultaneously designing products, the manufacturing processes that will make them, as well as designing the wider supply chain of which that manufacturing activity is an important part. Now, the one thing we have learned is that in the context of innovation, and going back to the 4 fundamentals idea which I introduced previously, there is a hardwiring and a soft wiring element to this. The hardwiring element is very much about technology, and the Industry 4.0 framework is a very good way of thinking about this. And if we think about the sort of key pillars of Industry 4.0, they include things like autonomous robotics and the Internet of Things and augmented reality, and all of these have a hugely important role to play in terms of supply chain design. However, we also know that world-class supply chains have an equally strong focus on the people dimension, or the soft wiring. And that puts me in mind of an Irish Nobel Literature laureate who wrote about the human chain. And that was a book really which was about relationships between people, between teams, between the past and the present. But one thing it does is it reaffirms the centrality of interconnectedness between different phenomena. A lot of it relates back to engineering for people, and we're very proud at Aston to be part of Engineers Without Borders, which is about exactly this. Leadership is a vital element of the people dimension. That puts me in mind of another Irish Nobel Literature laureate, Samuel Beckett, who famously said, "Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better." So really what it's saying is good leaders are not afraid to try new things, and that's an important message. The other thing that's interesting is logistics and supply chain professionals have moved away from being purely subject matter experts and have moved towards being internal consultants and culture managers. And in that context, we often talk about the development of T-shaped supply chain professionals. The vertical part of the T is really about the specialist skills and knowledge around warehouse design and inventory optimization and supply chain modeling that all supply chain professionals need to know about. But the horizontal part is really about recognizing that to effectively deploy that specialist knowledge, we need to understand the wider context. And the final thing on this is that we know that world-class supply chains are characterized by high levels of diversity. So the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda is massively important from a supply chain point of view. So by way of conclusion, you'll be glad I'm on to my last slide. I think the supply chains of the future will be smart and sustainable supply chains. They will have 4 key characteristics. They will be globally connected. That global connectivity is facilitated or enabled by quite advanced technology. They will be environmentally sustainable, and they will be structurally resilient. And to achieve that, we've got to recognize that if we stand still, that effectively means that we're falling behind. In this context, innovation is critical. Innovation with its roots in the Latin word novus, meaning new. It's about finding new and better ways of doing things. And it's about 2 types of innovation. It's about innovation through supply chain process improvement, and technology and hardwiring has a key role to play in that. But it's also about recognizing that people and learning and relationships and the soft wiring are also critical success factors. So that's about innovation through people. Now, finally, the current pandemic, I think, has allowed us to identify and to recognize key workers in critical professions. What it's had the effect of doing in the supply chain world is making our supply chains more visible, but thankfully for very positive reasons. So there's now a much wider recognition, I think, of the critical strategic role of logistics in keeping the country moving during this most challenging of periods. But we do know that we have significant room for process improvement. And I hope that And my contention is that the application of some of the ideas and approaches which I've set out in this talk offers some potential to contribute positively in this regard.
Thank you, Ed, for delivering our first ever Aston Talk. That was fantastic. I've got a few questions now. Are you happy to answer them?
Absolutely, Martin.
Really good questions from the audience, so I'll just bring up the first one now. In a business environment where the supply chain is currently fragmented across different functions, buying, logistics, quality, etc., are there any gold standard methodologies of abstracting supply chain functions from those subdivisions into a supply chain management department?
Gold, that's a very good question, given the importance of integration. Gold standard methodologies, I think there are many methodologies, and as I said, albeit in a slightly different context, it's probably important to recognize that different methodologies have been designed for use in different contexts. So I think rather than, again, trying to look for one single gold standard methodology, it's probably more sensible to look at a range of methodologies and try to identify the one that's most appropriate in a particular situation. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Ed. There are increasing number of overseas warehouses that have relocated to the Midlands in the past few months with their flows of capital, talent, goods and services. Is the current literature review examining this trend?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of that is a consequence of changes in the international economic and business environment. Some of it's to do with the impact of Brexit. I think we see within companies a big focus on trying to figure out what the best ways forward are. And a lot of our academic research is really focused on trying to figure out how organizations can do things in a better way to really grapple with some of these challenges. So, you know, every cloud has a silver lining. Yes, we have seen an incredible growth in the logistics sector. It's one of the few sectors that has not just survived, but has in fact prospered over the last few months for a whole variety of reasons. And I think that brings enormous opportunities.
Thank you, Ed. Brexit disturbs integration, disrupts flows and damages relationships across supply chains with the UK's biggest market. What must the UK do to overcome this mega challenge?
Wow, how long have we got? I mean, that's an enormous question. I think a lot of organisations have been working very hard to prepare for Brexit. The big problem that many have faced is, as I mentioned in my talk, 65 days before the end of the transition period, we still have a huge amount of uncertainty about what will happen on the 1st of January. But the reality is that, you know, even a relatively good free trade agreement, and that's looking increasingly unlikely, but even a relatively good FTA will still mean that we have more friction than we had as members of the European Union. And as I mentioned in my talk, it's often been the logistics sector which has been at the vanguard of trying to deal with this. So there's a lot that government is doing, and there's more that it should be doing. There's a lot that companies have been doing, and there's a lot more they need to do. One of my big concerns is that, as I mentioned during my talk, the logistics sector comprises a very large number of relatively small companies with relatively small bandwidth in terms of innovation and change, and that makes this a particularly challenging period for them.
Thank you, Ed. That's great. One final question. How do you envisage the challenge of global simultaneous vaccine distribution?
That's a very good point. I mean, I think had I had a bit more time, I would have spoken a bit more about this. I think the biggest challenge facing the profession at the moment is around building a supply chain which will have the capability of delivering the vaccine to millions of people, tens of millions of people in this country, and literally billions of people globally. So what worries me slightly is that there's a huge amount of fantastic scientific research, quite rightly happening, to develop this much needed vaccine. But I do worry that when we develop a vaccine, or perhaps more likely a set of vaccines, that we simply won't have the supply chains in place to roll out this vaccine efficiently and effectively to the billions of people that we need to. So that's a really big ticket item for us over the coming months.
Thanks again, Ed. Take a bow, and I'll now pass back to the Vice Chancellor to wrap up the evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And look, it does fall to me to thank Ed for his lecture this evening. We will obviously receive feedback subsequently, but I do think the format has worked well, and it's been great to have someone of Ed's standing to hold the first online inaugural lecture for us in the Aston Talks series. You've obviously had the opportunity to hear from Ed, who is internationally recognised as a leader in his field, but what he's clearly demonstrated this evening is not only is he completely on top of his subject, but he has a capacity to communicate with a very broad audience, including people on this call who will no doubt be experts in the field, as well as many people who will not be experts in the field of logistics. And suffice to say, I think Ed has hit the mark very well in terms of communicating across that broad audience. I think the other thing I'd comment about this field is I do think it is very much, not surprisingly, an area of importance to Aston, because this is very applied and pragmatic research. In some sense, the fact that Ed spent so much time talking about the implementation conundrum, the concern that we are learning a lot in some sense about the theory of logistics, but the challenge, of course, and a concern always for Aston is how do we bring know-how to impact in the real world. And suffice to say, Ed laid out some of the numbers and the criticality of the scale of this challenge. So it is vitally important, and the challenge for us in some sense is how do we make sure that know-how has effect within the economy. And of course, this field is one which, whilst Ed understandably identifies very strongly as an engineer, in some sense certainly spans across the engineering business interface. It's interesting, and I think many people who would know Ed would probably find it surprising that he's giving an inaugural lecture when he must have been at the university for in excess of 5 years. We are dealing with a backlog here. I'm very conscious that I've been in my role now as Vice Chancellor for over 4 years, and Ed was on the selection committee for the Vice Chancellor when I was appointed, which means I'm not looking to blame lay the blame on that appointment with Ed, but I do want to identify that Ed has been at Aston, let me say, well in excess of 5 years. So we are catching up with a backlog of inaugural lectures, and we are seeing people who are both, let me say, quite established leaders at Aston as well as new leaders. I would like to, on behalf of all of us, thank you, Ed, for your presentation this evening. I think it's been a fantastic first lecture in this Aston Talks series. And on behalf of all of us, I'm sure there is applause in the background that you can't hear, but we'll take that as a given.